"If you wish to place an order, rise and do so yourself." Someone guffawed loudly, indicating the man in the wheelchair situated near the counter. The entire cafe erupted in laughter, a few individuals capturing videos. He showed no reaction, merely gazing directly ahead towards the window. Half an hour thereafter, 4 military SUVs were stationed outside. 6 Marines entered. Who was seated in the center of the cafe? Edward Ed Blake, 71. Frequented Bayview Beans Cafe every Friday at precisely 2 p.m. The custom never altered. He would navigate his wheelchair to table 6 by the window, request a black coffee accompanied by a slice of apple pie, and dedicate exactly 90 minutes to observing the harbor, where Navy vessels occasionally anchored. Today marked the 5th anniversary of his weekly visit to this ordinary cafe in Pensacola, Florida. The staff recognized him as a reserved, dignified patron. What they were unaware of was the burden of memory Edward bore, both metaphorically and tangibly, within the small wooden container that perpetually rested on his lap. Inside were his Marine Corps decorations, discolored photographs of young men in desert attire, and letters he had never dispatched to the families of those who did not return. Edward had lost both legs in Afghanistan, just outside Kandahar. An improvised explosive device had terminated his 30-year military career and taken the lives of 2 Marines under his leadership. His weathered countenance, permanently bronzed from years in foreign deserts, betrayed little of the physical discomfort that still troubled him. The emotional injuries, however, were apparent in his eyes, distant, observant, yet somehow reconciled with what life had presented him. This particular Friday, Bayview Beans was alive with uncharacteristic activity. A contingent of college students, commemorating the conclusion of their final examinations, filled the typically serene afternoon with loud conversation and mirth. Edward maneuvered his wheelchair through the congested area with skilled precision, nodding courteously when people shifted tables to allow his passage. At his customary location, he placed a small, laminated card on the table which stated, "Veteran, please serve gently." The entreaty was not for preferential treatment but a pragmatic acknowledgement of his occasionally unsteady hands and startled responses to abrupt movements, lingering effects from his period in combat. Megan, a new waitress in her early 20s, approached with a tentative smile. "Good afternoon, sir." "The usual?" Edward assented, his voice a raspy murmur, developed from years of issuing commands over helicopter noise. "Thank you, young lady." From an adjacent table, 3 men in their 30s, well-attired in business casual clothing, observed the interaction. One nudged another, whispering something that elicited snickers. Edward feigned not to notice, concentrating instead on positioning his wooden box exactly parallel to the table's edge. "Observe this individual," one man remarked, loudly enough to be audible several tables away. "Special service for the supposed hero. What sort of veteran employs a wheelchair as a device for attention?" Megan froze, the coffee pot held midair, her gaze shifting between Edward and the men. "It is quite all right," Edward stated calmly. "Please proceed." The leader of the group, emboldened by Edward's lack of reaction, raised his voice further. "What sort of veteran solicits special treatment with a little card?" "My grandfather served in Vietnam, and he never requested assistance." The cafe quieted for a moment, patrons glancing uncomfortably between the hecklers and Edward, but no one intervened. Edward simply drew his wooden box nearer, as if shielding the memories within from defilement. With deliberate composure, he sipped his coffee, gazing out the window while disregarding the ongoing taunts. His reaction, or absence thereof, seemed to further annoy the men, who began to speculate loudly about fraudulent veterans and professional sufferers. Megan approached him once more, her voice barely discernible. "Sir, would you like me to request that they cease? Or perhaps summon the manager?" Edward looked up at her, a gentle smile forming on his weathered face. "No need, miss. There was a period when words such as those would have affected me. That period has long since passed. He resumed his coffee and his view of the harbor, seemingly unfazed by the escalating hostility just a few tables away. The wooden box remained under his protective hand. As Edward sipped his coffee, the three men grew increasingly audacious. The tallest, sporting an expensive timepiece and a smirk that implied he had never been refused anything, began recording with his smartphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a bona fide American hero," he narrated derisively. "So heroic, he requires a special card to obtain his coffee." His companions laughed as prompted. Several cafe patrons shifted uneasily in their seats, but intervention was confined to disapproving looks. When Edward reached for his fork, his hand quivered slightly, a consequence of age and nerve damage from his military service. The utensil slipped from his grasp, falling with a clatter onto the floor beside his wheelchair. "Stand up and retrieve it yourself," shouted one of the men, instigating another bout of laughter. Edward evaluated the circumstances with tactical precision. The fork lay just out of his reach. Attempting to recover it would necessitate maneuvering his wheelchair in the limited space, potentially inconveniencing other customers. With the same measured patience that had once guided him through minefields, he commenced the careful task of repositioning his chair. Megan hurried over. "Please, allow me to get that for you, sir." Edward paused, looking up at her with clear eyes. "It is quite all right. I am accustomed to it." His simple reply, devoid of self-pity or anger, fell into a suddenly quiet cafe. The weight of his quiet dignity seemed to momentarily subdue even the heckler's enthusiasm. In that brief interval of quiet, an older woman seated alone in the corner observed Edward more intently. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition as she noted the small bronze pin on his jacket lapel, a distinctive insignia representing a specialized Marine unit that had been disbanded years earlier. Without attracting notice, she exited the cafe, phone already in hand. The moment passed. The three men, perhaps discomfited by the temporary silence their cruelty had engendered, intensified their efforts. The leader posted the video online with the caption, "Coffee Shop Warrior Cheap Drama." Within minutes, notifications began to illuminate his phone as the post gained popularity. "Look at that, we're achieving viral status," he declared proudly. "People enjoy seeing these counterfeit heroes unmasked." Edward continued consuming his apple pie in deliberate bites, his expression unaltered. To casual onlookers, he appeared either unaware of or resigned to the ridicule. However, the slight tensing of his jaw and the methodical manner in which he repositioned his wooden box indicated an awareness of every utterance. A middle-aged man in unremarkable attire, seated at the counter, observed the scene with concentration. When Edward opened his box to check his watch, revealing a glimpse of military medals inside, the observer's eyebrows rose fractionally. He quietly settled his bill and stepped outside, phone pressed to his ear. "Captain, it's Dawson. You will not believe whom I just encountered at Bayview Beans." "Yes, sir, Edward Blake. The Edward Blake from Fallujah." "No, sir, I am certain. Still possesses that wooden box. They are disrespecting him, sir." "Yes, sir, I will await here." Inside the cafe, the situation continued to worsen. One of the men crumpled a napkin and threw it towards Edward's table, landing it perfectly in his open wooden box. Inside, partially visible now, lay a weathered envelope. The exposed corner revealed a handwritten line. "If I never make it back, Ed is the man to trust." Edward's hand moved with surprising swiftness to close the box, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wooden edges. For the first time, his expression darkened momentarily before reverting to its practiced neutrality. "Ooh, did we strike a chord?" taunted the leader. "What is in the box, old man? Tokens of participation?" A few customers began to collect their belongings, uneasy with the escalating situation but unwilling to become involved. The cafe manager, a young man barely out of college, hovered uncertainly near the counter, clearly torn between confronting paying customers and protecting another. Edward checked his watch again, a military-issued timepiece with a scratched face that had endured more combat than most soldiers. It was now 3:15 p.m. 15 minutes remained in his weekly ritual. Despite the hostility surrounding him, he showed no signs of departing early. As if sensing the unasked question, he spoke softly to Megan when she brought him a refill. "I come here every Friday at this time because I made a promise." "A promise to whom?" she asked, glancing nervously at the three men who were now scrolling through their phones, admiring their growing social media attention. "To the men who couldn't come home," Edward replied simply. "We agreed that whoever survived would remember the others." This was the last American cafe several of them visited before deployment. He gestured subtly toward the harbor. "Their ship left from that dock." Megan nodded, suddenly understanding the ritual's importance. "They are still viewing the video." "It already has hundreds of views," she whispered, horrified. Edward's expression didn't change. "Young lady, when you've had actual bullets fired at you, camera phones don't seem very threatening." Outside, more vehicles began arriving in the parking lot, their occupants remaining inside with engines running. The man named Dawson stood by the entrance, checking his watch periodically as if awaiting a precisely timed operation. Edward Blake continued his vigil by the window, seemingly oblivious to the mockery and the gathering storm outside. His weathered hands rested protectively on the wooden box, guarding memories that no viral video could ever diminish. The mockery reached its zenith when the tallest man, emboldened by online affirmation, approached Edward's table. Leaning down with a condescending smirk, he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You know what I think? I think you're wearing that veteran gear from a costume shop." Edward met his gaze with steady eyes that had once tracked enemy movements across mountain ranges but said nothing. "Real soldiers have discipline, strength," the man continued, enjoying his audience's attention. "They don't beg for sympathy with little cards." Several customers looked away in embarrassment. Megan hovered nearby, coffee pot clutched like a weapon, uncertain how to intervene. One of the man's companions aimed his phone directly at Edward. "Come on, hero, say something for our followers. They're loving this expose of stolen valor." Edward's silence seemed to infuriate them further. The leader reached toward the wooden box, fingers inches from the lid. "What's so precious in here, anyway? Let's see these supposed medals." Edward's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping the man's wrist. He didn't squeeze or twist, just held it with the quiet certainty of someone who had once subdued enemies with his bare hands. "Not this," Edward said softly. "Not ever this." The sudden reaction startled everyone, including the heckler who yanked his arm back as if burned. "Did you see that? He assaulted me." He looked around for support, finding only uncomfortable stares. "I'm getting the manager. This guy's dangerous." Outside, a synchronous rumble of engines broke the tension. Through the cafe's large front windows, patrons watched as 4 black military SUVs pulled up in perfect formation. Behind them, a command jeep flying a Marine Corps flag stopped directly at the entrance. The cafe fell completely silent. 6 Marines in immaculate service uniforms entered with disciplined precision. Their crisp movements and decorated chests spoke of extensive combat experience. The oldest among them, a silver-haired man with a bearing of natural authority, surveyed the room before his eyes locked on Edward. The 3 hecklers, suddenly pale, retreated to their table, one frantically trying to delete the video from his social media. As the Marines approached Edward's table, the silver-haired officer stepped forward and rendered a perfect salute. "Sergeant Major Blake, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, sir. We apologize for being late." The other Marines formed a respectful semicircle around Edward's table, each saluting in turn. The oldest officer continued, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent cafe. "Sergeant Major Blake led one of the most successful rescue operations in modern Marine Corps history. Fallujah, 2004. 12 Marines cut off behind enemy lines. Against direct orders, Blake went back in. He turned to address the entire cafe now. I was one of those 12. 3 days pinned down, ammunition nearly gone. Blake not only found us, he created an extraction route by clearing buildings single-handedly. He was shot twice during the operation but refused medical evacuation until every Marine was accounted for. The officer's voice tightened with emotion. When the helicopter finally lifted off, insurgents targeted it with RPGs. Blake used his body to shield 2 wounded Marines. The resulting injuries eventually cost him both legs, but he saved every one of us. From a polished wooden case, the officer produced a gleaming medal on a blue ribbon. The Navy Cross. This should have been awarded years ago. Administrative errors and Blake's own insistence on avoiding recognition delayed this moment. Today, we correct that mistake. As the medal was ceremoniously placed in Edward's hands, one of the younger Marines stepped forward, his voice breaking slightly. "Sergeant Major Blake pulled me from burning wreckage after our vehicle hit an IED. I've waited 15 years to thank you, sir." The cafe remained frozen in stunned silence as each Marine shared a brief testimony of Edward's impact on their lives. Several patrons wiped away tears. The 3 hecklers, now hunched in their seats, stared fixedly at the floor. When the last Marine finished speaking, Edward finally broke his silence. "These honors belong to those who didn't come home," he said, voice steady. "I accept only as their representative." Megan, the young waitress, had retreated behind the counter, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered when Edward caught her eye. "I should have said something, should have stopped them." Edward shook his head gently. "You've done more than enough. You've provided a place for remembrance every Friday for 5 years. That matters more than you know." One of the hecklers, shame finally overwhelming arrogance, approached hesitantly. "Sir, we had no idea. The video. I'll take it down immediately." Edward regarded him thoughtfully. "Leave it up, sir. Let people see what happens when we judge without knowing someone's story. Perhaps it will make them think twice next time." The cafe manager, finally finding his courage, approached. "Sergeant Major, your money is no good here anymore. Not today, not ever again." Edward shook his head. "I'll pay my bill like anyone else. Special treatment wasn't what I fought for." As the Marines prepared to depart, having completed their official mission, the silver-haired officer leaned close to Edward. "We'll be back next Friday if that's acceptable. Some debts can never be fully repaid, but we'd like to try." For the first time that day, Edward's stoic expression softened into something resembling a smile. Table 6. 1400 hours. Bring stories of the others. After they departed, Edward remained at his table, completing his ritual 90 minutes as originally planned. The 3 hecklers left quietly, their social media accounts now flooded with angry comments as the truth about Edward spread across local networks. Before Edward departed, Megan approached one final time. "Can I ask what's in the box?" "The one you protected so carefully." Edward hesitated, then opened the wooden container. Inside lay several medals, yes, but also a collection of small personal items: a worn baseball, a poker chip, a scratched Zippo lighter, a folded sonogram image. "These belong to men who asked me to remember them," Edward explained. "Things they carried for luck or love. I promise to protect them until we meet again." Megan nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "And that's why you come here? To keep that promise? Every Friday, same table, same time." Edward closed the box carefully. "Because somewhere they're watching. Making sure I remember." As Edward wheeled himself toward the exit, customers stood one by one in silent respect, a belated but heartfelt acknowledgement of the quiet hero who had sat among them unrecognized for years. In the weeks that followed, Bayview Beans underwent a transformation that nobody could have predicted. Table 6, Edward's regular spot, now bore a small bronze plaque, reserved for those who served. When not occupied by Edward during his Friday vigil, the table was available exclusively to military veterans. A framed photograph of Edward receiving his Navy Cross hung nearby, captioned simply, "Not all heroes wear their medals." True to their word, the Marines returned the following Friday. 6 of them, representing different generations of service, joined Edward at a larger table pushed adjacent to his regular spot. Their conversation was quiet but punctuated by occasional laughter, the unique camaraderie of those who had faced death together and lived to remember those who hadn't. This became a new tradition. Each Friday at 2 p.m., Edward would arrive first, taking his place at table 6. By 2:15, he would be joined by Marines in civilian clothing, their military bearing unmistakable despite the casual attire. Sometimes there were 3, sometimes a dozen. The oldest among them had served in Vietnam, the youngest had recently returned from Syria. Edward welcomed them all equally as guardians of the same flame. The wooden box remained Edward's constant companion, but its contents had expanded. Each Marine who joined his weekly gathering contributed something small: a unit coin, a handwritten note, a photograph. One by one, they entrusted Edward with their most precious memories, understanding that no one would protect them more fiercely. Megan, the young waitress who had witnessed Edward's humiliation and vindication, requested permanent assignment to the Friday afternoon shift. Under her initiative, the cafe instituted a suspended coffee program where customers could prepay for veterans' orders. The wall near the register soon filled with posted notes from patrons: coffee for the next veteran, with gratitude, or meal for someone who served, in memory of my grandfather. The three men who had mocked Edward never returned to Bayview Beans. Their viral video, which they had left online at Edward's suggestion, became an unexpected educational tool shared by military family support groups and sensitivity training programs. It accumulated millions of views, each one a potential lesson in looking beyond appearances. Edward himself remained largely unchanged by his newfound local celebrity. He still arrived precisely at 2 p.m. each Friday. He still ordered black coffee and apple pie. He still spent exactly 90 minutes in quiet remembrance. The only difference was that he was no longer alone in his ritual. On her personal social media page, Megan shared a reflection that resonated far beyond her small circle of friends. I witnessed justice arrive not through angry words, but through a silence that made an entire room stand up. An elderly woman who had been present during Edward's humiliation later told a local newspaper, "I used to think he was just a lonely old man sitting by himself. Now I see he was a fortress we never recognized." Perhaps the most meaningful change came 6 months later when Edward allowed a local school group to interview him for a history project. After decades of silence about his service, he finally shared his story with the next generation, not tales of heroism or combat, but simple truths about loyalty, sacrifice, and remembering those left behind. When asked by a 10-year-old student why he hadn't defended himself against the mockery that day, Edward's answer was characteristically straightforward: when you've held dying friends in your arms, cruel words lose their power to hurt you. I've been wounded by experts. Another child asked what he wanted people to remember about veterans like him. Edward thought for a moment before responding that we are still keeping promises made long ago on battlefields most people have forgotten. The story of Sergeant Major Edward Blake reminds us that heroism rarely announces itself. It doesn't demand recognition or special treatment. Often it sits quietly among us, keeping decades-old promises that the rest of the world never knew were made. What strikes me most about this story isn't the moment when the Marines arrive to honor Edward, though that scene of justice brings satisfaction to anyone who values respect and dignity. No, what truly moves me is Edward's unwavering commitment to his weekly ritual, regardless of how others treated him. His dedication wasn't contingent on appreciation or recognition. He sat at table 6 every Friday, not for himself, but for those who could no longer be there. In our world of instant outrage and performative virtue, Edward's quiet dignity serves as a powerful counterpoint. He didn't need social media campaigns or public outrage to validate his worth. His value was established long ago in moments of sacrifice that most of us will never comprehend. Perhaps we all have something to learn from that wooden box Edward protected so fiercely. Like that box, each of us contains hidden stories and treasured memories that aren't immediately visible to others. Before we judge, before we mock, before we assume we understand someone's story based on outward appearances, we might remember the lesson of Bayview Beans. The quietest person in the room might be the one who has given the most. In a world that increasingly values noise over substance, may we all learn to recognize the Edward Blakes among us, those quiet heroes whose greatest battles and most profound victories might never make headlines, but whose character shapes the world around them in ways we rarely acknowledge until someone helps us truly see.